The Walker in the Attic, Edogawa Rampo. He had read pharmacology books before and knew a little about morphine, but this was the first time he had seen it in person. He held the bottle up to the light and peered at it, and a tiny amount of white powder, barely half a teaspoon's worth, glistened beautifully. It was so intense that it made him wonder how someone could die from something like that. Of course, Saburo didn't have a precise scale to measure it out, so he had no choice but to trust Endo's word about the dosage. But Endo's attitude and tone at the time, even though he was drunk, did not seem to be lying. Moreover, the number on the label was exactly twice the lethal dose that Saburo knew, so there was no way he could be wrong. So he placed the bottle on his desk, lined up the sugar and pure water he had prepared next to it, and began to diligently mix the poison with the meticulousness of a pharmacist. It seemed that all the residents had already gone to sleep, and the area was silent. As I poured the pure water into the bottle, drop by drop, my own breathing echoed like the sigh of a demon. How much this satisfied Saburo's perverse desires. The image of the terrifying witch from an ancient tale would come to mind before his eyes, grinning wildly as she gazed upon a pot of poison that was bubbling and boiling in a dark cave. However, from around that time on, a feeling similar to fear, something he had never anticipated before, began to well up in the back of his mind, and as time passed, it grew little by little. Murder cannot be hid long, a man's son may, but at the length truth will out. Those eerie words from Shakespeare, which he had remembered from someone else's quote, shone like a blinding light into his brain. Even though he was convinced that his plan would never fail, he was powerless to control the anxiety that was growing with each passing moment. Was it insane to kill a person he had no grudge against just for the fun of it? Am I possessed by a demon, or have I gone mad? For a long time, forgetting how late it was, he sat lost in thought in front of the bottle of poison he had mixed. I should give up on this plan for good. He was close to making this decision many times, but in the end, he just couldn't bring himself to give up the allure of murder. However, as he was pondering this, a fatal truth suddenly flashed across his mind. Suddenly, Saburo burst out laughing, as if he couldn't help but find it amusing, but in a small voice that the sleeping residents couldn't hear. "I idiot! What a fool I am! To be so serious about planning something like this. Has my numb brain become so incapable of distinguishing between coincidence and necessity? Just because Endo's gaping mouth was directly under the knothole once, how do I know it will be there again the next time? In fact, it's simply impossible. It was a truly ridiculous error. His plan was a huge delusion from the start. But how had he managed to not realize such an obvious thing until now? It's truly strange. Perhaps this was evidence that there was a serious flaw in his pretentious mind. Whatever the case may be, this discovery deeply disappointed him, but at the same time, it made him feel strangely at ease. Thanks to that, I no longer have to commit the horrible crime of murder. I'm saved. However, even from the very next day, whenever he took his attic walk, he never failed to open that peephole with lingering regret, checking on Endo's movements. One reason was that he was worried that Endo might realize that he had stolen the poison, but he also couldn't help but long for that coincidence. Like the other day, when Endo's mouth would somehow end up right under the knothole. In fact, on every single one of his walks, he kept that poison in his shirt pocket. One night, it had been about 10 days since Saburo began his attic walk. It was no mean feat for him to crawl around the attic multiple times a day for 10 days without being noticed. Meticulous attention, such ordinary words cannot possibly describe it. Saburo once again wandered around the attic of Endo's room. And with the feeling of drawing a fortune, wondering whether it would be good or bad, perhaps today would be good. He opened the knothole and looked, even praying to God that he would be blessed with good fortune. And then, oh my goodness, Endo was snoring, positioned exactly as he had seen him the other day, with his mouth directly below the knothole. Saburo rubbed his eyes several times, looked again, and even untied his trouser strings to try and estimate by eye. But there was no mistake now. The string, hole, and mouth were in a straight line. He barely managed to hold back the urge to scream. He was filled with a strange excitement, a mixture of joy that the time had finally come, and indescribable fear. And in the darkness, he turned pale. He took the bottle of poison from his pocket and, keeping his hands still and trembling on their own, uncorked it, using the string to guide the drops. Wow, the feeling at that moment is indescribable. And then, drop by drop. That was all he could do. He immediately closed his eyes. Has he noticed? He must have noticed. And any moment now, I wonder how loudly he'll scream. If only his hands were free, he would have wanted to cover his ears. However, despite his great concern, Endo below him didn't utter a single nod or hiss. He had definitely seen the poison fall into his mouth, so there was no doubt about it. But what was going on? Saburo timidly opened his eyes and peered through the knothole. Then Endo closed his mouth, rubbing his lips with both hands. Once again, he fell fast asleep, snoring away. It's often said that giving birth is easier than worrying. In his sleep, Endo was unaware at all that he had swallowed a horrible poison. Saburo stared intently at the face of the poor victim, without moving. It felt like a long time. In fact, less than 20 minutes had passed, but to him it felt like 2 or 3 hours. At that moment, Endo suddenly opened his eyes. He then sat up halfway and looked around the room with a puzzled look on his face. He shook his head, rubbed his eyes, muttered meaningless, delirium-like things, and made all sorts of crazy gestures. But finally he went back to the pillow. But this time he started tossing and turning vigorously. After a while, his tossing strength gradually weakened, and just when you thought he had stopped moving, a thunderous snoring sound began to ring out. I looked and saw that his face was bright red, as if he were drunk, and beads of sweat were breaking out on the tip of his nose and forehead. While he is deep asleep, a terrifying struggle for life and death may be taking place inside his body. It was chilling to think about. After a while, his once red face gradually cooled, turning paper white, and then in the blink of an eye, it turned a deep blue. Then before I knew it, his snoring had stopped, and his inhales and exhales became less frequent. Suddenly, his chest stopped moving, and I thought that this was the end. But after a while, as if he remembered, his lips started twitching again, and his heavy breathing returned. This repeated 2 or 3 times, and then it was the end. He didn't move again. His face, slumped limply from the pillow, wore a kind of smile entirely different from those in our world. He had finally become a corpse. Holding his breath with sweaty hands, Saburo watched the scene, and for the first time heaved a sigh of relief. He had finally become a murderer. But what an effortless way to die. His victim died snoring, not even a cry or a look of agony. What? Murder can be so easy. Saburo was somehow disappointed. Murder, which had been the most fascinating thing in his imagination, was no different from any other everyday occurrence when he actually tried it. With this kind of skill, he could kill any number of people. While he thought about this, an indescribable fear slowly began to creep up over his deflated heart. In the dark attic, with its ridgepole and beams crisscrossing in all directions like a monster, Saburo found himself clinging to the ceiling like a gecko or something, staring at a human corpse. And suddenly he felt a tinge of unease. I felt a strange tingle in the back of my neck, and when I listened carefully, I even felt as if I could hear my name being called, slowly, slowly, somewhere. I instinctively took my eyes off the knothole and looked around in the darkness. but it was probably because I had been looking into the light for so long. One after another, yellow ring-like objects, big and small, appeared and disappeared before my eyes. As I stared, it seemed as if Endo's abnormally large lips would pop out from behind the rings. But he had definitely carried out the initial plan. He threw the medicine bottle, which still contained a few drops of poison, through the knothole, sealed the hole, and checked with a flashlight to see if there were any traces of anything left in the attic. Now that he realized he hadn't overlooked anything, he hurried back up the ridgepole to his room. It's finally over. His head and body felt strangely numb, and he felt as if he had forgotten something. So he tried to suppress this feeling of anxiety as he began putting on his kimono in the closet. But at that moment, he suddenly realized what had become of the trouser string he had used for that measurement. Perhaps he had left it there. Thinking this, he hastily felt around his waist. It seemed not to be there. He became even more panicked and searched his entire body. So how could he have forgotten something like that? But it was there, neatly in his shirt pocket. Relieved, he went to take out the string and flashlight from his pocket, but to his surprise, there was still something else inside. The small cork from the poison bottle. When he was about to drop the poison, he had put the stopper in his pocket, fearing it would be a disaster if he lost it. But it seems he had completely forgotten about it and dropped the bottle only. It was a small thing. But if he had left it in his pocket, his crime would be discovered. He had to calm his fears and go back and drop it through the knothole. That night, Saburo didn't get into bed until around 3 a.m. Lately, he'd stopped sleeping in the closet as a precaution, but his excitement hadn't subsided, and he couldn't fall asleep easily. Just like that time I forgot to drop the cork, there might have been other mistakes too. Thinking about this, he became increasingly uneasy. So forcing himself to calm his agitated mind, he tried to recall each and every action he had taken that night, in order to see if he hadn't done anything mistake. But at least in his mind, he could find nothing wrong. No matter how he thought about it, there was not the slightest mistake in his crime. He continued thinking like this until dawn broke. But when he heard the footsteps of the early rising lodgers walking down the hallway to the bathroom, he rose to his feet and suddenly began getting ready to go out. He dreaded the time when Endo's body would be discovered. How should he react when that happened? If he were to act strangely, it could lead to others suspecting him, which would be a big problem. So he figured it would be safest to go out at that time. But wouldn't it be even weirder to go out without having breakfast? When he realized this, he crawled into bed. How terrified Saburo must have been for the next 2 hours until breakfast. Fortunately, nothing happened until he hurriedly finished his meal and fled the lodging house. After leaving the boarding house, he wandered from town to town with no particular destination in mind, just to pass the time. In the end, his plan was a brilliant success. When he returned from outside around noon, Endo's body had already been cleared away, and the police had completed their investigation. As expected, no one suspected Endo's suicide, and the police officers left immediately after a brief questioning. No one knew why Endo had committed suicide, but based on his usual behavior, everyone agreed that it was probably the result of a love affair. In fact, it had even come to light that he had recently suffered a broken heart with a certain woman. Heartbroken is just a catchphrase for a guy like him and doesn't really mean anything. But since there was no other reason for his suicide, it was ultimately concluded that this was the cause. Not only that, whether there was a reason or not, there was no doubt whatsoever that he had committed suicide. The entrance and windows had both been locked from the inside, and the poison container was lying next to his pillow, a property that was known to have belonged to Saburo. So there was no room for suspicion. No one raised the ridiculous suspicion that someone might have dropped poison from the ceiling. Still, Saburo still felt unable to relax and spent the rest of the day feeling nervous. But as the days passed, he gradually began to calm down and even began to feel proud of his skill. How great I am! No one could possibly suspect that a murderer as terrifying as me is living in the same boarding house as them. He thought, There was no telling how many crimes there were that went unpunished in this world. Heaven's net is wide and loose, but nothing escapes it, is surely nothing more than propaganda used by rulers since ancient times, or perhaps just a superstition among the people. And in reality, if you do it cleverly, any crime can go unnoticed forever. That's what he thought. Still, at night especially, he felt as if Endo's dead face might suddenly appear before his eyes, which was rather unsettling. Since that night, he had even stopped his usual roof walk. But that was merely a matter of his own mind, and he would likely forget it soon enough. Now it was exactly 3 days since Endo had died. Just as Saburo had finished his evening meal and was humming a tune while using a toothpick, Akechi Kagoro suddenly dropped by for the first time in ages. "Hi, it's been a while." They exchanged pleasantries like this, but Saburo couldn't help but feel a little uneasy about the amateur detective's visit, given the circumstances. "They say someone died from poisoning in this boarding house." As soon as Akechi sat down, he immediately brought up the subject Saburo wanted to avoid. Akechi had probably heard about the suicide from someone, and fortunately, Saburo was living in the same boarding house, so his natural detective interest led him to visit him. "Yeah, morphine. I wasn't there when the commotion happened, so I don't know the details, but it seems like it was the result of a love affair." Saburo, trying not to let it be obvious that he wanted to avoid the topic, replied with a look of interest on his face. "What kind of man is he?" Akechi immediately asked. For a while after that, they continued to ask and answer questions about Endo's character, the cause of death, and the method of suicide. At first, Saburo was nervous about answering Akechi's questions. But as he got used to it, he became more and more lazy, and eventually even felt like teasing Akechi. "What do you think? Maybe this is a murder. I don't have any particular evidence, but it's not uncommon for something to be believed to be suicide to actually be murder. Even a great detective like you wouldn't know this," Saburo thought to himself. But he went so far as to say this. It was hilarious to him. "Well, it's hard to say. Actually, when I heard this story from a friend, I thought the cause of death was a little vague. I wonder, maybe we could go see Endo's room." "That's easy," Saburo replied rather smugly. "There's a friend from Endo's hometown living in the room next door. Endo's father has asked him to store some belongings for him. If we tell him about you, I'm sure he'll be happy to show us around." Then the two of them decided to go to Endo's room to take a look. At that moment, walking at the head of the corridor, Saburo suddenly felt a strange sensation. It's rare, even in the distant past, for the murderer to personally guide a detective to the scene of a murder. He barely managed to hold back a grin. Saburo had probably never felt more proud in his life than he did at that moment. "Hey, genius!" He was so excited he felt like shouting that at himself. Endo's friend, his name was Kitamura, and he was the man who had testified that Endo had been heartbroken. He knew Akechi's name well and kindly opened Endo's room for him. Endo's father had only just come from his hometown and held a temporary funeral this afternoon, and his belongings were still lying around in his room, unpacked. The suspicious death was discovered after Kitamura had already arrived at work, so he didn't seem to know much about the circumstances surrounding it. But he gave a fairly detailed explanation, putting together what he'd heard from others. Saburo, acting like an outsider, also babbled on about rumors and other things. As Akechi listened to the two of them, he looked around the room with the discerning eye of a true professional. When he suddenly noticed the alarm clock on the desk, he stared at it for a long time, seemingly thinking about something. Perhaps it was the unusual decoration that caught his eye. "This is an alarm clock, right?" "Yes, it was Endo's pride and joy," Kitamura replied talkatively. "He was a very meticulous man, and he would unfold it every night without fail so that it would ring at 6 in the morning. I was always woken up by the sound of the bell from the next room. Even the day Endo died was like that. It was ringing that morning, so I never imagined something like that had happened." Hearing this, Akechi ruffled his long hair with his fingers, looking very enthusiastic about something. "Did the alarm really go off that morning?" "Yes, that's for sure." "Didn't you mention that to the police?" "No, but why did you ask?" "Because isn't it strange? for someone who decided to commit suicide that night to turn up the alarm for the next morning. I see. Now that you mention it, it does seem strange. Kitamura had apparently never really noticed this until now, and he still didn't seem to fully understand what Akechi meant. But that's not entirely unreasonable. The fact that the entrance was locked, the poison container lying next to the dead man, and everything else about it made Endo's suicide seem undeniable. However, listening to this exchange, Saburo felt a sense of shock, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly begun to crumble. And he couldn't help but regret his own foolishness, wondering why he had brought Akechi to such a place. Akechi then began to examine the room even more thoroughly. Of course, he couldn't miss the ceiling either. He tapped each ceiling board one by one, searching for any signs of human entry or exit. But to Saburo's relief, even Akechi, as expected, didn't seem to notice the method of dripping poison through the knothole and then sealing it back up, and once he confirmed that not a single board had come loose, he didn't investigate any further. In the end, nothing of note was discovered that day. After Akechi had finished looking around Endo's room, he returned to Saburo, where they chatted for a while, before returning home without incident. However, I cannot leave out the following exchange of questions that took place during that chat. The reason is that, although this may seem trivial at first glance, it actually has the most important bearing on the outcome of the story. At that moment, Akechi lit a cigarette he'd taken from his pocket and suddenly remarked as if he'd just realized something. "You haven't smoked a cigarette in a while. Have you quit smoking?" And it was true, Saburo hadn't smoked a cigarette even once in the last few days, as if he had completely forgotten about his favorite food. "That's strange. I'd completely forgotten. And even when you're smoking, I don't feel like having one at all." "Since when?" "Come to think of it, I haven't smoked in a couple of days." "That's right, I bought the cigarettes here on a Sunday, so that means I haven't smoked a single cigarette in 3 days. I wonder what's going on. Well, it must have been the day Endo died." Hearing this, Saburo was taken aback. However, he never imagined there could be any causal connection between Endo's death and the fact that he didn't smoke, so he simply laughed it off at the time. But looking back later, it was by no means a trivial matter that could be dismissed as a laughing matter. And strangely enough, Saburo's aversion to cigarettes continued forever after that. For a while, Saburo couldn't sleep soundly at night because he kept worrying about that alarm clock. Even if it were proven that Endo did not commit suicide, there should be absolutely no evidence to suspect Saburo as the culprit. So he shouldn't need to worry so much. But knowing that Akechi is the one investigating it, he simply cannot feel at ease. However, about 2 weeks passed without incident. Akechi, who he had been worried about, never came by again. Well, this is finally the end, Saburo thought. And so Saburo finally began to let his guard down. And although he was occasionally plagued by terrifying dreams, for the most part, he was able to spend his days happily. What made him especially happy was that, ever since committing the murder, various games that had never interested him before had strangely become fun. These days, he would leave the house almost every day to play around. One day, after staying up late outside again, Saburo returned home around 10 o'clock. He decided to go to bed and casually opened the sliding door to the closet to get out his futon. Wah! He suddenly let out a terrifying scream and stumbled back a few steps. Was he dreaming? Or had he lost his mind? There, in the closet, Endo's dead head, hair disheveled, was hanging upside down from the dimly lit ceiling. Saburo went to the entrance, intending to escape. However, feeling like he might have mistaken it for something else, he timidly turned back and quietly peeked inside the closet once more. Not only was he not mistaken, but this time the head suddenly grinned. Saburo let out another gasp, ran to the entrance in one go, opened the sliding screen, and tried to run outside. "Mr. Goda! Mr. Goda!" Seeing this, someone from inside the closet began repeatedly calling Saburo's name. "It's me. It's me." There's no need to run away. It wasn't Endo's voice, but someone else's, a voice he seemed familiar with, so Saburo stopped running and timidly turned around to look. Excuse me, excuse me. As he spoke, descending from the ceiling of the closet, just as Saburo himself had done before, was, surprisingly, none other than Akechi Kogoro. Sorry to startle you, Akechi said with a smile, emerging from the closet in his traditional clothes. I was just trying to imitate you. It was in truth a far more terrifying reality than any ghost could ever be. Akechi must surely have figured everything out. Saburo's state of mind at that moment was truly beyond description. Everything was spinning in his head like a windmill, and he could only stare blankly at Akechi's face, as if he had nothing to think about at all. Right off the bat, this is a button from your shirt, isn't it? Akechi began speaking in a very businesslike tone. Holding a small button in his hand, he held it out in front of Saburo and said, I checked with the other lodgers, but none of them have lost a button like this. Ah, it's from your shirt. Look, the second button's missing. Realizing this, he looked at his chest, and sure enough, one button was missing. Saburo hadn't even noticed when it had come off. It's the same shape, so there's no doubt about it. By the way, where do you think I found this button? In the attic, above Endo's room, in fact. But still, how could Saburo have dropped a button and not noticed? Besides, hadn't he checked thoroughly with a flashlight back then? Didn't you kill Mr. Endo? Akechi smiled innocently, which only made it feel more unsettling in this situation, peering into Saburo's helpless eyes as he delivered the final blow. Saburo knew it was over. Even if Akechi constructed the most ingenious deductions, if they were only deductions, there would always be room for defense. But confronted with such unexpected evidence, there was nothing he could do. With the expression of a child on the verge of tears, Saburo stood frozen in silence, seemingly for an eternity. Occasionally his vision would grow hazy, and strangely, distant memories, like events from his elementary school days, would surface like phantoms. For about 2 hours after that, they faced each other in Saburo's room. Thank you for honestly opening up to me, Akechi said finally. I'll never report you to the police. I just wanted to confirm whether my judgment was correct. As you know, my interest lies solely in knowing the truth. Beyond that, it really doesn't matter to me. Besides, there isn't a single piece of evidence for this crime. The shirt button? Haha, that was my trick. I figured you wouldn't go along without some kind of evidence. When I visited you last time, I noticed that second button was missing, so I decided to make use of it. Well, I went to a button shop and bought this one. No one really notices when a button comes off, and besides, I figured you'd be flustered, so it would probably work out. As you know, what made me suspect Endo's suicide was that alarm clock. After that, I visited the chief of the police station in this jurisdiction and was able to hear the details of what happened at the time from one of the detectives who conducted the raid here. According to his account, the bottle of morphine was lying next to the cigarettes box, and morphine had spilled onto the box. The police didn't seem to pay it much attention, but when you think about it, isn't that highly peculiar? I hear Endo is a very meticulous man, and it seems somehow unnatural that someone who had prepared himself to die by getting into bed would place a bottle of poison on top of a tobacco box and spill its contents. This only deepened my suspicions. Then it suddenly struck me. You stopped smoking cigarettes the very day Endo died. These two facts seem a bit too coincidental to be mere chance, don't you think? That's when I recalled how you used to enjoy mimicking crimes. You had a perverse fascination with criminal acts. I've come to this boarding house often, secretly searching Endo's room without you knowing. And since I figured out the only way the culprit could have gotten in was through the ceiling, I decided to use your so-called attic walk to observe the other boarders. Especially above your room, I often crouch for long periods. And I could see clearly your irritated state. The more I investigated, the more all the circumstances pointed to you. But unfortunately, there wasn't a single piece of conclusive evidence. That's why I came up with that little play, ha 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 ha. Well then, I'll take my leave now. Probably won't see you again. Because you've made up your mind to turn yourself in, haven't you? Saburo felt nothing at all toward this trick of Akechi's. As he watched Akechi leave in a daze, he found himself musing absent-mindedly about what it must feel like to be executed. He thought he hadn't seen where the bottle of poison fell when he dropped it through the peephole. But in truth, he had clearly seen the poison spill onto the cigarettes. And that was pushed into his subconscious, making him mentally averse to cigarettes.
This is the end of this story. Now, is there anyone listening to this video in the southern hemisphere? The sun's rays are gradually getting stronger, and the sunshine feels very pleasant. Please spend this bright season with a smile and in good health. Some of you may be listening in the northern hemisphere. Winter is gradually approaching. The cold will get a little more severe, but I think this is the season when hot drinks and meals are most comforting. I hope you are well and healthy. See you again in a month.